part is from Fort Wayne here in Indiana. In 2017, she received her Bachelor's of Life Science in Chemistry from MIT.
During this time, she's worked to alleviate poverty with the MIT Global Poverty Initiative and has led a project to address poor maternal health and high rates of miscarriages in Indonesia. She's also an MD student at the University of Michigan. And so her recent research has focused around different surgical innovations and applications, including things like lung trauma and also treatments for strokes. She's also explored other aspects of STEM by starting a project and co-founding it called CodePhil, which is just a project that aims to help support rural Filipino youth by spreading access to digital literacy. So that's enough from us, and we're excited to hear your perspective. So
thank you. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. So my name is Jiwon. I'm a fourth-year medical student at University of Michigan now, and today I kind of wanted to put a spin on something that we talk about all the time that you see in the lab with the scientific method and how that applies to your life. So no disclosures. So obviously you guys are probably very familiar with this chart. For any experiment, you have the observation, you come up with a question, you create a hypothesis, you do a bunch of experiments to test your hypothesis, and then come up with some results and conclusion, and oftentimes you have to repeat this process over and over again. So I'll basically be talking about how you can look at your life in this lens as well. So the first part, since you guys are probably very interested in science and are here for that reason, I wanted to start with the most obvious application of the scientific method, which is for research. And so this is a research project that I've been working on recently in the Department of Orthopedic Surgery, and it's on plantar plate repairs. And so the plantar plate is a ligament in the bottom of your foot. Basically helps stabilize the MTP joint in your lesser joints. So the MTP joint is kind of like at the very end of your toe. It's often, the plantar plate is often torn in what's called turf toe, colloquially, if you've had it or not, or like hammer toe or crossover toe. And normally that happens when you tear the plantar plate because it provides a lot of stability in the sagittal plane, so the side plane of this toe. So the surgical repair of the plantar plate, you can do it through a dorsal approach or a plantar approach. So dorsal as in you would make the incision in the top of the foot to get into the plantar plate, and then also from a plantar approach where you would just go in from the bottom of the foot to approach the plantar plate. And although there are these two main approaches to the plantar plate, the most common way is actually to go through the dorsal approach from the top of your foot. Because it's, even though it's like farther away from the plantar plate, because you actually disrupt less of the plantar plate that way. But the problem is that when you do this repair from a dorsal approach, you use a tool in the operating room called the McGlamry elevator, and you can see it here. That's the side view of an x-ray of the McGlamry elevator, and it's basically a spoon that you stick in the toe to lift the plantar plate off of the metatarsal, which is kind of like the bone that is at the end of your toe. And the problem is that surgeons do this all the time for orthopedic foot and ankle surgeons do this all the time, but no one really knows what the consequence in terms of the vasculature that you disrupt when you do this. So it's like, oh, what happens to all the blood vessels that go possibly to the plantar plate when you do this? And so that was kind of the premise of this project. There's other projects or other studies that have been done on the plantar plate in the past, like this paper from 2019 that shows the vascular supply of the entire length of the plantar plate. And so you can see the plantar plate is in green here and the vasculature is in red. And then also on this figure on your right, you can see that actually the density of vasculature is highest at the proximal or the farthest end of the plantar plate and at the proximal, the closest, and the distal ends here. And so this is like an interesting lead up to this question, because for us, we're specifically looking at how the McGlamry elevator, which you would rip this area of the plantar plate, disrupts the vasculature. So essentially the question for us was, what is the relative contribution of the blood supply to the proximal plantar plate from the bone, which comes from the top, and then also the plantar fascia that comes from the bottom. And so essentially for the methods, we used 16 human cadavers, and then that led to 35 lower extremity toes to use for the study. And basically we perfused barium sulfate, which is radio-opaque and can be seen under CT scan, into actually the tibial artery so that we could actually identify where the vasculature was. And then for the image analysis, we basically used a software called Dragonfly, which is an image analysis software to analyze the images in 2D and 3D, these nano CT scans that we had obtained. And basically we created these regions of interest in the software to figure out exactly the two parts of the plantar plate that we were most interested in, which is, like I said, the part that's attached to the bone and then the part that's attached to the plantar fascia, which is the bottom of the foot. And so this is basically a representation of some of the results that we found. You can see that in red is, again, the vasculature, and then green is the entire length of the plantar plate. And then the blue here is actually the exact part of the proximal plantar plate that you disrupt with the Glamry elevator, and then the yellow is what you would what is attached to the plantar fascia. And you can see in panel D, that's a 3D reconstruction of the plantar plate from a sagittal view, so the side view. So essentially the results of that were that the dominant vasculature supply to the plantar plate actually comes from the attachment to the bone, the metatarsal side, which is from the top of the foot. And so you disrupt the major vasculature supply to the plantar plate using the McGlamry elevator. And I know like this sounds really stupid because for you probably are not interested in toes at all, and you're doing like much more complicated projects now, but for surgeons, especially foot and ankle, who do this procedure day in, day out, this is like a very important finding. And so actually like we were recently like notified, we're like a finalist for this like American Orthopedic Foot and Ankle Society Award for research, because apparently this is a really big finding. That you disrupt the major supply to this tiny ligament that's like not like it's like this small in your foot. So basically the conclusion is that the vascular supply of the proximal plantar plate is mostly supplied by it's supplied by both the metatarsal pedicle and the plantar fascia, but the majority of it is from the metatarsal pedicle. So that was like a brief blurb about some research and how obviously we all apply the scientific method to research. But now I wanted to kind of shift gears and talk about how I feel like some of the things that I've done in my life maybe also apply to the scientific method. So in high school, this was me. I mainly just played piano. I don't really know how I got into MIT. Yeah, sometimes apparently my parents have told me that other parents have asked them like, oh, how did your child get into MIT? And they're like, oh, she played piano. So that was like the biggest thing that I did. And but other than that, I never participated in SSP, unfortunately, but I did do research at the NIH for a similar high school summer program at NIH if you guys are interested and want to apply in the future as high school students. And then I also did a summer at Stanford, and that was like another summer high school research program. So I was interested in science, but like most of the time I played piano. And I think my goal in high school was like I told the high school newspaper that I wanted to be like the WHO director one day for the World Health Organization. That didn't come into fruition yet, but that was like what I was interested in. So my hypothesis going into college was that I was actually going to major in computational biology, and that was what I wrote about in my application to MIT when I applied. I got there and I took like intro bio, ended up getting a C at intro bio. And I also worked in I worked at the MIT Whitehead Institute and did a lot of like biology research, looking at the mTOR pathway, so doing like Western blots all the time, PCRs. and I also like hated it. I feel like I left lab every day just like in misery. So I was like, oh, what to do? My hypothesis may be wrong, and now I have all this data that supports that I like don't like doing this. So instead of doing like more biology research, I did like really random things. I ended up going to India to work on cataract surgery research in Hyderabad, and then randomly ran into a group of MIT researchers from the MIT Media Lab who happened to be there at the same time, and they were helping to kind of like scale low-cost technology for eye, like ophthalmologists mainly. But then they like somehow got invited to Nasik, where the Kumbh Mela was about to happen, and the Kumbh Mela happens to be like a huge Hindu religious gathering that happens like about every 12 years. And they say it's like one of the largest human gatherings in the world. And somehow I ended up in this random city with these like MIT researchers, and we were trying to develop some technology to kind of be used at the next Kumbh Mela. So that's why like this random picture here, I ended up in like the front page of a Indian newspaper while I was there randomly, and I was developing technology. But I thought it was so cool. So then afterwards, I traveled to Indonesia, and I had a few friends at Harvard who were from Indonesia, and had brought up this idea to basically sell wicker products that rural Indonesian women make to hotels in Bali. So I ended up going to Bali for a while, and then also like hopping around to different rural islands, trying to scale this technology, or well, scale this company mainly, so that we could support women in these rural areas. And then, like I said, I played a lot of piano in college, and I continued to play a lot in high school, and I continued to play a lot in college too. And I feel like this is like this article, like they happened to like write about me in undergrad is like a summation of what I did there, because I played piano, and I actually like ended up playing a concerto with the MIT Symphony Orchestra, and then I'm wearing my safety goggles because I was in chemistry lab all the time. So that was kind of like how I shifted gears from computational biology to more like chemistry, global development work, and then also like tech development that I was really interested in at the time. So in addition to doing that, I still felt like I didn't find the perfect field for me. So I was trying to figure out other avenues to use my science background. And one of the ways that I did that was I worked at the World Bank for a summer in undergrad as well, and I worked in their solid waste management program, which is also super random, because I didn't know anything about waste. But surprisingly, there's a lot of like parallels to how different chemicals are exposed to people in the air and stuff like that. So it was a good way to kind of combine my chemistry background with some of my global development interests. And then I also did a lot of work with the United Nations and their science policy interface. So I worked in New York City and Geneva, also traveled to like Rome and the Dominican to kind of channel some of the ideas that youth, like young people under the age of 30 had on science issues around the world. So that was something that I like randomly got into in college and have been kind of continuing until today. And it was a way to just apply my science outside of the lab as well. And then after college, I lived in Poland for a year on a Fulbright scholarship, doing more chemistry research, and it was kind of figuring out how to control the oxygenation process using various metal products. And there, I also ran into some random people. All these random things happened to me, and I actually like gave a TED talk. I didn't think I had anything worthwhile to say, but like I made up something to say. And so I gave a TED talk at the Warsaw School of Economics in Poland as well during my time there. And then after coming back from Poland, I decided to do one other thing that I wanted to make sure was not right for me, which was management consulting. So I worked in consulting and helped kind of pharmaceutical companies manage their clinical trials for about a year when I was working there. I absolutely hated it. Turns out I hate traveling Monday to Thursday and being on the planes every week. I also just felt like, I don't mean to like shame anyone who has like parents who work in consulting or anything, but for me, I just really did not enjoy. I just felt like there was like no purpose for me to be there, and I was just plugging a lot of numbers into Excel. So basically, after all of those experimentations, I decided that I wanted to be a physician because it was the best way to combine all of my interests in science and global development, and just like being able to see, like help people and see it right away was really impactful for me. So I ended up going to medical school at University of Michigan Medical School, where I'm now a 4th year. And in medical school, I've kind of continued to do some of the things that I've enjoyed throughout undergrad as well. And so I've been doing more policy work with the American Medical Association, working in student council, also basically organizing medical affidavits for asylum seekers in Michigan. So basically people from, like especially from Mexico, Central America, and Africa who come as victims of like torture or domestic abuse and are seeking asylum status in the US. They often really benefit from having a medical evaluation from a physician that shows kind of the trauma that they've endured mentally and physically. And so I've been kind of working on coordinating those types of evaluations for asylum seekers. So basically we can come back to the chart that we started with. So in high school I found out that I liked science and math. That was my observation question, should I major in biology? My hypothesis was being a computational biologist will be a great idea. And then I did all of this other random work, and my conclusion was that I was going to be a physician. So now that I'm in my 4th year of medical school, I am I decided what I'm going to apply into, and I'm applying into orthopedic surgery. And so like this is me basically learning how to saw the tibia here. I'm sawing the tibia, yeah. Oh no, yeah, I'm sawing the tibia, yeah. So sawing the tibia here, and I've continued to play piano. This is me playing the piano in my white coat at actually a ceremony where we kind of honor the people who have donated their bodies to be cadavers, basically, for us to use during our medical studies. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at now in terms of the whole like circle that I've gone through. So the third part I wanted to share kind of that I feel like I failed at, and my hypothesis was definitely rejected, was some of the side hustles that I've done over the years. So kind of like you mentioned, I worked on this project in the Philippines, and now it started in 2015, so now it's been 7 years that it's been continuing. And it's basically a nonprofit to empower rural high school students in the Philippines through computer programming. And so our original hypothesis for this was we were going to use computer programming to address the conflict between the Muslim and Christian population in this random island, again random, island in southeast Philippines called Mindanao. And turns out that computer programming is not the best way to address the conflict peacefully. But we did find out during that there's a great need for digital literacy education among rural islands in the Philippines. And one of the reasons is because there's actually, even to this day, there's very limited internet and sometimes no internet in these places. So they can't access a lot of computer resources. So we spun our project around and we're like, oh, now we're gonna teach coding at these rural high school students and create coding curriculums that can be accessed offline. And so I traveled to like 8 different rural islands in the Philippines, distributing and training teachers on how to use this coding curriculum, and then also like brought some different types of tools to help teach. And so basically, once we were there doing that, we learned that actually the students can't type. So actually like less than 1% of the students in the Philippines can type properly with all 10 fingers. And most of the students are using, like the chicken finger. And mainly because there's just like not a lot of resources for computers in these rural islands. So we, as a result of that, created a new software that could also be downloaded and used offline called Typeville, and basically that teaches students how to use the keyboard with all 10 fingers, and incorporate some like cultural like activities into that as well. And so it's like a super simple software actually, not complicated at all, but it's something that was like really needed in a country where you wouldn't have imagined. So this is just like some footage from all of our coding sessions in the Philippines over the years. And it's kind of cool because some of the students that we worked with ended up going to university for computer science after this program. I don't know if this is like some of the animation that you can code. And there's me in college. Yeah, and I forget what these robots are called, but we also showed them how to do that and brought those along as well. So I guess for the last part, I just wanted to talk about how this like scientific method applies to happiness that I've learned over the years. So I feel like in high school, I had this hypothesis that happiness was tied to my success, where I went to college, how many publications I had, how many awards I had. And I worked really, really hard trying to get those things. But turns out I also got really sad doing all of those things as well. And I just remember like in undergrad, I was in my dorm and then like just like sitting there really sad at MIT. And I like wasn't sure why, because I had gotten into top college, I had great friends, I was doing all this cool work and interesting research, and I thought like everything should have been fine, but I was still really sad. So it took me a while, and I feel like I'm still working on it, but I'm just trying to figure out like what happiness means to me, and I realized like very late in my life that it's not really about like where you go to college or what others think of you, or like how many awards you have on LinkedIn or how many connections you have on LinkedIn or how many likes you get on Instagram. So I think that's like something that I'm still growing to learn, but I think when I was in your shoes at your age, I was like, that was the only thing that mattered to me. And I just realized over the years that like you can still be really sad even if you've accomplished like those things. So I think it's really important to find happiness in the things that truly make you happy and not things that you're just doing for the sake of doing. And for me, I've learned that that's like seeing my friends. So here, this is like, actually I was just in Las Vegas this past weekend. It was Pi reunion. So for MIT, we have, I guess you guys will find out if you apply to MIT, which everyone should, because MIT is awesome, but like you find out your acceptance on March 14th, which is Pi Day, and then after you graduate, your first reunion is 3.14 years after you graduate, and for me, adjusted for COVID, that was this year, so we had a lot of fun parties in Vegas with our entire classmates. And then I've also just realized like simple things like my dog, Whiskey, like just hugging her, things like that make me really happy. I did not get married, but my younger brother got married, and that was like a fun time. And then I also really enjoy skiing. So like when I was in Poland, I went skiing in the French Alps, and like I try to go skiing out west every year or two. So I feel like those are the things that like actually make me happy. And at this point in my life, I've been just trying to tell myself, like even at this junction I'm in like a kind of a similar junction as you guys, because you guys are applying to college now. I'm applying to orthopedic surgery residency, which is also extremely competitive, and also like 90% dominated by men. So it's like, it's a lot of pressure for me right now as well, but I'm just trying to tell myself that like, at the end of the day, it's not really about like where I get in for residency and how prestigious that program is, but just like that I have these things around me that I can still cherish. So I just want to end on 3 notes that I wish I had known in high school. So first, it's okay to be unsure, regardless of how systematic we try to be. Like any science experiment, there's a lot of like exceptions, errors, confounding variables in science, and I feel like that's also true in life. So it's okay to make mistakes, and even in cases when things seem to defy methodical logic, I think the scientific method is still relevant, and you can use that evidence as your future experiment. And the second thing is like ask wild questions. So I feel like you never know what you're going to learn about yourself or the natural world unless you ask these questions and the right questions. So I would just say like continue to like believe in yourself and inspire yourself to ask these like wild questions and like have big standards for yourself, because you'll never know until you try. And then finally, don't be afraid to fail, because I think in stats you can accept a hypothesis or like fail to reject a hypothesis, but you can't just outright fail it. So I think that's also true for life. I don't think that like even though I've made a lot of mistakes in my career and personal lives, like I try to think that those are it's just data that I've gathered for future experiments, and the more data that you have, the higher your power, and the higher the confidence interval. So it's actually not as bad as you may think. So, and then I wanted to end with someone who is much wiser than me, Thomas Edison. And if you find 10,000 ways something won't work, you haven't failed. Don't be discouraged, because every wrong attempt discarded is another step forward. So I feel like you guys are obviously scientists in the lab. I just hope that you continue to apply that inquisitive nature to your life as well going forward. All right, thank you. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can you explain what the cataract surgery, the research you were doing in India was?
Oh, yeah, so I was working on 2 different projects there for cataract surgery. So the first one was on looking at surgical outcomes of cataract surgeries done in kind of these like rural secondary hospitals in India, and seeing how that compared to the outcomes of cataract surgeries at the main hospital in Hyderabad. So looking at like whether good cataract surgeries can be done in these rural areas. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
As like an MIT student,
Yeah,
the saying is like you're a small fish in a big sea.
yeah.
How difficult was it to find like opportunities in a pool of like the most competitive students in the world?
Yeah.
Arguably.
So I feel like first, it's not competitive at MIT once you get there, because everyone is already super smart, but they make the curriculum so hard that like it's like everyone's like basically like trying to survive. It's like it's the attitude that I gathered, and also that was like kind of echoed at my recent reunion for college. So I think for the opportunities, yes, you're in a pool of very talented students, but there are so many opportunities. So this is also something that my friends and I were talking about, because some of us like we went to MIT for undergrad, and then we went to a public university like University of Michigan or Berkeley for grad school, and we were just noticing like the class size at MIT is much smaller than other bigger universities. And on top of that, we just like didn't realize this when we were there, but there was just like you could go anywhere you wanted, do anything you wanted, and it would be funded for. And there was like no competition for the funding. It was just like, oh, okay, like my friend was actually telling me at this reunion recently that senior year he got an email, his MIT email that said, oh, free trip to Saudi Arabia. And that was like the title of the email. And then, at first they initially thought it was a prank, but turned out it was like actually real, and just anyone who wanted to go to Saudi Arabia for a week could go. I don't know exactly what they did there, that would be me, but so yeah, and like all of my projects in undergrad, traveling to India, to Indonesia, working at the like World Bank and things like, all of that was funded by the MIT, and that was like also something that was facilitated by the university. So I feel like that was never a problem, you know, when I got there. Sure.
This is essentially two different questions. When you're choosing your specialty or thinking about it, do
Yeah.
you have any other options in mind, and what ultimately led you to choosing orthopedic surgery?
Yeah. So let me just tell you a quick stereotype about orthopedic surgeons. A lot of them have played Division I college sports. And like I said, 90% are male. And most of them are also like Caucasian. So I actually like went into medical school because I was neither of those things. I was none of those things. Not very athletic, to be honest. But I went into school, and since I thought I did all this work with global development, I would go into like family medicine and practice in a rural community center, or do internal medicine. And also some of the research that I did in undergrad in the chemistry department was related to drug delivery, like platforms for cancer drug delivery. So I thought maybe I would do hematology and oncology as an internal medicine doctor. But turns out I'm like also like, I don't have ADHD actually clinically, but I have a really short attention span in general. And internal medicine is very cerebral in that it's a lot of thinking about like what medications to give, or like how to adjust doses, or and just the enigma of what does this person have, like what disease do they have. And for me, that wasn't really my style of thinking, and I really liked doing things with my hand and seeing them basically like fixed the next day, or like at least like different in a different state, like the very next day. So that's why I decided I leaned more towards surgery. And then within surgery, I was like, oh, so back in the, I was very hardcore, and I was gonna be like, I'm gonna be a neurosurgeon, I'm gonna be like Sanjay Gupta. And it turns out neurosurgery is extremely sad and demanding, the type of patients you see. And I was like, okay, so that's not for me. And then for a while, I dabbled in ENT, which is otolaryngology, or ear, nose, and throat surgery, because I thought the cool cancer surgeries for head and neck cancers were really interesting. But it turns out that I don't really like saliva, and I don't really like all the spit, so that really kind of went out the door. But I did like research in all those areas as well, just to like really know that I didn't want to do those fields. And then I circled around, and I was really interested in general surgery, which is basically like all of your intestines, your gallbladder, your pancreas, your butt, and then also like cardiovascular surgery is like under general surgery as well. And I thought I wanted to do that because I thought I wanted to help people like right when they're about to die or something, and like fix them at that moment. And I realized that like over time I met these patients and like saw these patients after surgery, and some of these patients who had like terrible heart attacks, terrible strokes, terrible cancers, and to be honest, like they were still sad after they had survived all of that. Like, yes, there was some relief and happiness that they're still living, but like for some of the patients that I saw, it was just not like how they wanted to live the rest of their life in that state. So that's why I pivoted to orthopedic surgery, because I felt like orthopedic surgery, you really get to help people in their quality of life and help them just live happy in the way that they want. And like for me, within orthopedic surgery, I'm actually not interested in the foot that much, even though I do research on the foot. I am interested in joint replacements, so like hip and knee replacements for elderly people who have a lot of osteoarthritis of those joints. And I feel like it's so rewarding to literally, like they're in so much pain, they can't play with their grandchildren or even walk like a couple blocks, and then literally the day of surgery, as soon as they wake up from anesthesia, they can walk. And I think that's just so cool. And also ortho, you get to use a lot of interesting devices. So some people who are not orthopedists, like internal medicine doctors, like to make fun of orthopedic surgeons because they think that what we do is carpentry. Because there's a lot of like nailing, drilling, hammering, and sawing involved in the work, but I think it's so cool. And I just like find it so exhilarating when I get like blood and bone on my face. But we do wear like spacesuits, like masks, so we don't like, doesn't get in my eyes, but and like just the reward of seeing the patients like the very few hours after the surgery being able to like walk and be so happy. Yeah. Alright, well, if you don't have any other questions, I'll also be around for dinner tonight, so I'm happy to chat with you at that time as well.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Would you recommend cancel?
That's a really good question. I think you should definitely explore different options within science before you just like automatically decide to become a physician. Because to be honest, the road is not easy. As you know, it's like 4 years in med school, and then depending on what specialty you go into, it can be anywhere from 4 to like 8 years. And then there's a fellowship after residency too for a lot of specialties. And during all that time, you're working really, really hard, like literally up to 100 hours a week sometimes for surgery specialties especially, and get paid very little. And I see my friends actually like from undergrad at MIT who like work core 6 or computer science, and they didn't have to go to grad school or any kind of school after undergrad, and have like seem to have really great jobs doing tech, and to be honest, like are making a lot of money and able to work remotely half the time and stuff like that. So I think like if you decide to go to medical school, you should really be invested in wanting to help people and being able to sacrifice a lot of your life for it, because like you will be burnt out really quickly and unhappy, I think, if you like truly don't want to do that. And I think another thing is that I thought at first that the only way I would be able to help people is through medicine, and I think that's not true. I think that you can help people in a lot of different ways, not being a physician as well. So I would just explore different options, test it out, and then officially decide. Yeah, go ahead.
So you earlier mentioned about how when you went to private school and how you go to a public school for graduate school. You briefly mentioned like the difference between it, but can you talk about the social aspect of it?
Oh, I think that you can get a good education anywhere, to be honest. It's really like about what you make out of it. I know like I had friends, because I grew up in Indiana, who went to Indiana University for undergrad, and then they actually went on to like be Rhodes Scholars and like studied at Cambridge or Oxford, wherever they go afterwards, and because like they're super motivated people and they're just hardworking people and smart. And so like I think that it doesn't really matter where you go as long as like you have a clear goal of what you want to get out of it and work really hard. But I think the difference that I've noticed, and it may be different because I'm not doing 2 undergrad experiences, I'm doing an undergrad and then a graduate experience, is that for the private university like MIT, just because the class size is smaller, and I think relatively like obviously the endowment is larger, like per person, if you calculate it, you know, it was just easier to access certain resources. But at Michigan, like we have the same resources, but sometimes it's a little bit more competitive. Like you have to be more proactive about getting those things. I think that's like the big difference that I've gotten. But I think another thing about being at Michigan is that like well, at least in medical school, the type of patients that I get to see are different, and I feel like I get to collaborate with different types of institutions at Michigan that I wasn't able to at MIT. So yeah. There you go.
So like you did work that's like helping people like more systematically, like with the code fill project,
Yeah.
doing like systemic changes, but then like transitioning into something like surgery where you're
Yeah.
just looking like one single
Yeah.
person at that moment. Like, could you just explain like the difference between that and like which one is like more fulfilling at?
Yeah. I think that when you make these systemic changes, it's cool to see like the numbers of like, your impact. The impact in terms of the number of people you impact is obviously much bigger. And in medicine, it's more one-on-one, you're right. I think for me, I gravitated more towards medicine and the one-on-one because I like that direct impact right away, that you can see right away. And like you get to, a lot of the interactions that you have in medicine are more longitudinal. So you get to see that person over and over again, usually. Even if you do surgery, like you will see them for several months after their surgery. And I think that was really meaningful for me. And then I also just appreciate the personal connections that you make in medicine, and being able to like actually see and meet and like learn about the family of the person that you're impacting. And I felt like for like clinical work and some of my like policy work that I did, it's great that you're impacting a lot of people, but like you don't really get to know those people as well. Yeah. So, but I'm hoping that in my future career I get to still combine both. Yeah. Then I don't think that you have to absolutely choose one or the other. Yeah.
You mentioned the gender disparity in your field earlier.
Yeah.
What obstacles have you faced, and how would you say you've dealt with those obstacles?
Yeah. So some of the obstacles I think for going to ortho, I actually was on my pediatrics rotation as a second year. So we have to go through all the different fields as a second year. And one of the pediatricians told me that I was going to struggle in surgery because like of my race and gender, and then also just the way I speak, which I like didn't understand very much. And that was like really hard to hear like directly from a person, because I felt like even growing up in Indiana, to be honest, like there wasn't really like outright racism like that, where people were telling me that I couldn't do something to my face. And then like obviously at MIT it was very, very diverse. So that was never something that like occurred to me. And then in medical school for the first time, like these disparities came to light. And obviously like, I don't think that like, I'm sure like some of my classmates like have dealt with more than me, but for me that was like something that I experienced and for the first time in my life. And so it was hard to have to like hear those things, and like even though like I know there's a lot of inspiring women who have gone into this field or surgeons in general, it's like sometimes really hard to break that mentality, and I guess that's what discrimination and racism is. And so I think that for me, I just had to like keep telling myself like to pursue what I love. And at the end of the day, like I don't really care what other people think. Like I will only find out that I can't be an orthopedic surgeon until like I don't get in, and I will like do my best to get in. And then like I was also concerned that like patients wouldn't appreciate me as much, because obviously in medicine it's a very one-on-one field. So like for example, like working at the Veterans Hospital, not everyone is like as accustomed to having such like a diverse like medical provider population. So it's like something like sometimes there are comments made, you know, to you that, but like I never took them to offense, to be honest, because they come from different backgrounds, but it does happen. And so one of my worries becoming a surgeon was like, will my patients appreciate me or like even respect me or like let me do their surgeries? But I've just talked to a lot of mentors in the field who have told me that as long as you work hard and like you try to be as skilled as possible, like that will not be something that like deters you or like hinders your career. So I've just been like believing in that and trying to do that for myself. But I'm sure that like for you guys, you're still young. People are still nice to you, hopefully. But if you do run into those things or like ever think, I know you guys are like, for now, like a lot of, you know, like women code, and like there's a lot of minorities in like fields that were previously not as diverse, but there's still like, over the course of your career, like you may face times when those things shine a little bit more than other times, and just like tell yourself that you're just like doing what you love and trying to help people.
So maybe that's a good time for us to move over to our more comfortable room. If you could give a big round of applause.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
So we're gonna move to the other room, probably if you can follow